when a homeless man named Elias reached out his trembling, dirt-stained hand to offer his very last dollar to a grizzled biker. The entire street seemed to go silent. It was a single, crumpled bill, the only thing he had to his name, given to a man who looked like he didn't need a dime. But Elias didn't see a stranger. He saw a brother in need. What happened the very next morning would stun the entire city and leave the local authorities speechless. When 300 Hells Angels pulled up to that same street corner, the roar of their engines shaking the very foundation of the buildings, they weren't looking for trouble. They were looking for Elias. And they didn't come for an apology. They arrived with a brand new truck and a promise that would change a forgotten man's life forever. This is a story about the hidden gold in the human heart and the legendary brotherhood that proves no good deed, no matter how small, ever goes unnoticed. Before we get into the heart of this incredible journey, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. We love seeing our biker community represented from every corner of the world. Now, let's head down to that rain-slicked street in Seattle where it all began. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It soaked into your very soul, turning the world into a blurred landscape of steel gray and asphalt. For Elias, the rain was a constant enemy, a reminder of everything he had lost. He was 64 years old, though if you looked at him, you'd swear he'd walked this earth for a century. His face was a roadmap of hard miles, deep creases around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun, and a silver beard that had grown wild since he lost his home 3 years ago. Elias sat on a cracked plastic milk crate outside a Chevron station on the edge of the industrial district. He wore a coat that had seen better decades, held together at the seams with silver duct tape that glinted under the flickering yellow hum of the gas station lights. Beside him was a piece of soggy cardboard with a simple, handwritten message. "Anything helps. God bless." Thousands of people passed Elias every week. To them, he was just part of the urban scenery, a fire hydrant, a trash can, a shadow in the doorway. They adjusted their ties, looked at their expensive watches, and quickened their pace, terrified that if they looked him in the eye, his failure might be contagious. But Elias didn't harbor bitterness. He remembered a life they couldn't imagine. He remembered being the man behind the counter, the master mechanic who could diagnose a misfiring cylinder just by the vibration in the floorboards. He remembered the smell of his wife's perfume and the weight of a mortgage. Then came the cancer, the medical debt that swallowed his savings like a sinkhole, and the eventual silence of an empty house he could no longer afford. It was just past 6 p.m. on a Tuesday when the atmosphere changed. The usual hum of commuter traffic was punctured by a sound that made Elias sit up a little straighter. It was a low-frequency throb, a mechanical growl that vibrated in the chest cavity before it even hit the ears. A lone biker pulled into the station. He was riding a customized Harley-Davidson Fat Boy, blacked out from the triple trees to the swing arm. Even in the gloom, the bike commanded respect. The rider was a mountain of a man, easily 6'4", with shoulders that looked like they were carved out of granite. He wore a heavy leather vest, the cuts of the Hells Angels, and his helmet visor was tinted dark, hiding his face from the world. This was Jax, a man whose reputation usually preceded him by 3 blocks. Jax kicked the stand down with a heavy thud of his boot and climbed off. But Elias, with the eyes of a mechanic, noticed something immediately. Jax wasn't moving right. He was stiff, his left leg dragging slightly, and as he reached for the pump, he let out a sharp, hissed breath of pain. He leaned his forehead against the seat of his bike for a moment, his gloved hand trembling. To anyone else, Jax was a threat. To Elias, he was a man in pain. Elias watched as Jax fumbled with his wallet. The biker pulled out a few crumpled bills, counting them with a frustrated shake of his head. He was short. He looked at the pump, then at his wallet, then back at the road. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than just needing sleep. Elias stood up. His knees popped like capped guns, and the cold wind whipped through his thin coat. But he stepped off his crate. He walked toward the pump, his shoes squelching in the puddles. Jax heard the footsteps and instantly went into a defensive crouch. He pushed up his visor, revealing eyes that were bloodshot and sharp as flint. "You lost, old man," Jax growled, his voice a low rumble that matched his engine. Elias didn't stop until he was 6 feet away. "I've been lost for a long time, son. But right now, I think you're the one having a rough go of it." Jax narrowed his eyes, his hand resting near his belt. "Get back to your crate. I don't have any change for you." "I didn't ask for change," Elias said softly. He reached into the deep, tattered pocket of his coat. His fingers closed around the only thing he had. A single, crumpled $1 bill. It was the dollar a kind woman had given him 3 hours ago. It was supposed to be his dinner, 2 items off the value menu at the burger joint down the street. It was all he had in the world. He held it out. The paper was damp, but Elias held it with the dignity of a man offering a king's ransom. "You're short on the fuel," Elias said, nodding toward the digital display on the pump. "And you're leaking primary fluid from that inner gasket. If you try to push that bike home with a dry tank and a bad seal, you're going to ruin a beautiful piece of machinery. Please take it. Get where you're going." Jax stared at the dollar bill. Then he looked at Elias, really looked at him. He saw the duct tape on the shoes. He saw the way Elias was shivering. He saw the hunger in the man's hollowed-out cheeks. "You're kidding me," Jax said, his voice losing its edge. "That's probably your last buck, man. Keep it. I'll figure it out." Elias stepped closer, placing the dollar on the seat of the Harley. "A man like you shouldn't be stranded in the rain. I'm used to the cold. This dollar won't make me rich, but it'll get you home. Consider it a gift from one mechanic to another." Jax felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. He was a Hell's Angel. People either looked at him with fear or with a desire to prove they weren't afraid. Nobody ever looked at him with pure, unadulterated kindness. Nobody ever offered him their last morsel of bread. "What's your name?" Jax asked, his voice thick. "Elias," the old man replied, already turning back toward his crate. "Ride safe, Jax. That back of yours needs some ice and a long rest." Jax froze. "How'd you know my name?" Elias pointed to the small, embroidered name tag on the front of the leather vest. "I might be homeless, son, but I ain't blind. And I know a bad back when I see one. My father spent 40 years on a factory floor. He moved just like you." Jax finished fueling his bike, using Elias's dollar to tip the balance. He didn't say thank you, not with words. He couldn't. He felt as if he spoke, the tough-as-nails persona he'd built over decades might just crumble right there in the Chevron parking lot. He kicked the bike into gear, the roar of the engine filling the space, and he pulled out into the rain. But he didn't go home to rest his back. Jax rode straight to the Hells Angels Mother Chapter Clubhouse. It was a nondescript brick building with reinforced doors and a sense of keep out that radiated for blocks. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco, old leather, and stale beer. About 30 of his brothers were there, men with names like Big Mike, Hammer, and Diesel. They were loud, they were boisterous, and they were in the middle of a heated argument about a run they were planning for the weekend. Jax walked in, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He didn't go to the bar. He didn't sit down. He walked to the center of the room, took the receipt from the gas station and the memory of that dollar, and slammed his hand down on the pool table. The room went dead silent. Pool cues stopped mid-stroke. "Listen up," Jax shouted. "I just met a man who lives on a plastic crate in the rain. He's got nothing. No shoes, no food, no roof." Big Mike, the chapter president, leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. "And the city's full of Jax. Why are you bringing the rain in here with you?" "Because," Jax said, his voice shaking with a rare emotion, "I was short at the pump. My back was out, I was hurting, and I was frustrated. This man, this Elias, he didn't ask me for a dime. He didn't beg. He stood up, walked into the rain, and gave me his last dollar. His last one. He told me he was a mechanic. He told me a man like me shouldn't be stranded. Jax looked around the room. We call ourselves a brotherhood. We talk about angels. But that man out there? He's the only angel I've seen in this city in a long time. He gave me everything he had because he saw a brother in trouble. What are we going to do about it? The silence that followed was heavy. These were men who had been through the system, men who had been betrayed, men who had fought for everything they owned. They understood the value of $1, but they understood the value of respect even more. Hammer, a man with a beard down to his chest and tattoos covering his neck, stood up. He gave you his last buck? His last one, Jax confirmed. I saw his face when he walked away. He was going to bed hungry tonight, so I could ride home. Big Mike stood up slowly, his leather vest creaking. He walked over to Jax and looked him in the eye. You said he was a mechanic? Said he spent 40 years under hoods. Jax replied. Mike turned to the room. Tommy, what happened to that '98 Silverado we took in on the trade last month? The one with the rebuilt engine? It's sitting in the back shed, boss, Tommy shouted. Needs a little body work, but the guts are solid. And the tool set from the estate sale? Mike asked. Still in the crates, another voice added. Big Mike looked at the clock. It was nearly 8 p.m., we've got 12 hours. I want that truck detailed. I want the oil changed, the tires checked, and I want that toolbox bolted into the bed. And I want every brother from the North and South chapters on their bikes by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Jax felt a grin spreading across his face. What are we doing, Mike? We're going to go pay our debt, Mike said, his voice like grinding stones. With interest. Throughout the night, the clubhouse was a hive of activity. The Hells Angels aren't just a club, they are a machine. One group was in the garage, buffing the silver paint of the Silverado until it shone like a new dime. Another group was at the 24-hour hardware store, buying high-grade sockets, wrenches, and diagnostic tools. Phone calls were made. Across the state, the word went out. It didn't matter if it was a workday. It didn't matter if they had plans. The story of Elias and the dollar bill spread through the chapters like wildfire. It resonated with these men. Many of them had started with nothing. Many of them had been the trash the world tried to sweep away. By 3 a.m., a line of motorcycles was already forming 2 towns over, riders checking their gear, their faces set in grim determination. This wasn't a protest. It wasn't a run. It was an act of war against the coldness of the world. Back at the gas station, the rain had finally stopped, replaced by a biting, damp cold. Elias was huddled in the doorway of a closed laundromat, his breath coming in small white puffs. He was hungry. His stomach felt like it was folding in on itself, but as he closed his eyes, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had helped someone. In a world that had taken everything from him, he had found something to give. He drifted off to a fitful sleep, dreaming of the sound of wrenches clicking and the smell of clean motor oil. He had no idea that in just a few hours, the sunrise would bring a thunder he'd never forget. As the first light of Wednesday morning broke over the Seattle skyline, the city began to wake up. Businessmen grabbed their lattes. Bus drivers started their routes. And in the distance, a low, rhythmic vibration began to pulse through the pavement. It started as a hum. Then it became a rumble. By the time the column reached the city limits, it was a roar that made car alarms go off as they passed. 300 Hells Angels. They rode in a perfect, staggered formation, a sea of chrome and black leather that stretched for half a mile. At the very front was Jax on his blacked-out Harley, and right behind him, the silver Silverado, driven by Big Mike, glinted in the morning sun. They weren't stopping for red lights. They weren't slowing down for traffic. They were a force of nature, moving with a singular purpose toward a rundown gas station and a man on a plastic crate. Elias was sitting back on his crate, his sign resting against his knees, when he felt it. The ground started to shake. He looked down at a puddle near his feet and saw the water dancing. He looked up, squinting against the morning light, and his heart nearly stopped. The street was being swallowed by motorcycles. He watched in terror as the bikes began to swarm the gas station. They circled the pumps. They lined the curbs. They filled every inch of the parking lot. The sound was overwhelming, a physical wall of noise that made it impossible to think. Elias scrambled to his feet, his back against the brick wall of the station, his hands raised instinctively. He thought he was about to die. He thought he had somehow brought the wrath of a gang upon his head. But then, the engines cut, one by one, until the only sound left was the tink-tink-tink of cooling metal and the heavy breathing of 300 men. Jack stepped off his bike. He removed his helmet, showing a face that was no longer hidden, but filled with a fierce, brothers-in-arms respect. He walked toward Elias. "Morning, Elias," Jack said. Elias was trembling, his eyes wide. I didn't mean anything, son. Whatever I did, I'm sorry. Please." Jack stopped and looked at the 300 bikers standing behind him. "Elias, look at me. You didn't do anything wrong. You did something right. And where I come from, when someone does something right, we make sure the world knows it." Jack stepped aside and pointed toward the street. The silver Silverado pulled forward, the engine purring like a jungle cat. "You gave me your last dollar yesterday," Jack said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Today, we're giving you your life back." Elias looked at the truck. He looked at the tools. He looked at the hundreds of men who were watching him, not with pity, but with a level of respect he hadn't felt since he wore a wedding ring. And that, my friends, was just the beginning of the longest day of Elias's life. Elias stood frozen against the cold brick wall of the gas station, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that had followed the roar of 300 engines was even more intimidating than the noise itself. He looked at the sea of leather vests, the tattooed arms, and the weathered faces of the Hells Angels. These were men who lived by their own rules, men the world viewed with a mixture of fear and fascination. And right now, every single one of them was staring at him. Jack stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small, rectangular object. It was a simple wooden frame. Inside, pressed against the glass, was a single, crumpled $1 bill. "Do you recognize this, Elias?" Jax asked, his voice low but steady. Elias swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was filled with dry sand. That's the dollar I gave you. For the gas." "No," Jax said, shaking his head. "To you, it was $1. To us, it was a reminder. We live in a world where people take. They take our time. They take our freedom. They take our respect. But you had nothing, and you gave. You saw a man you thought was in trouble, and you didn't hesitate." Jax turned to face the massive crowd of bikers. He raised the framed dollar high above his head. "Yesterday, this man gave me his last meal so I could get home. He didn't know who I was. He didn't care about the patch. He just saw a brother in need. I ask you, brothers, is this a man who should be sleeping on a plastic crate?" The response was a deafening, unified "no" that echoed off the nearby warehouses. Elias felt the tears starting to track through the dust on his cheeks. For 3 years, he had been invisible. He had been the man people walked around, the man the police moved along, the man the shopkeepers frowned at. To have 300 men shouting for his dignity was a shock that vibrated through his very bones. Big Mike, the chapter president, stepped forward. He was a man who looked like he could bench press a car, with a white beard and eyes that had seen more than their fair share of conflict. He walked over to the silver Silverado that was still idling smoothly. He reached into the cab, turned off the ignition, and pulled the keys out. Attached to the ring was a heavy brass tag engraved with a winged skull and the words, "Respect earned." He walked over to Elias and held the keys out. "Elias, I'm Mike. I hear you're a man who knows his way around a 350 small block." Elias looked at the keys, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them into his sleeves. I was. A long time ago, before the world got so complicated." "The world isn't complicated," Mike replied, pressing the keys into Elias's palm. It's simple. You look out for those who look out for you. This truck belongs to you now. It's got a fresh top-end rebuild, new brakes, and the suspension has been tuned for a heavy load. Because you're going to be carrying a lot of weight starting today. Elias stared at the keys in his hand. I can't take this, Mr. Mike. This is too much. It was just $1. I just wanted to help. That's exactly why you must take it. A voice called out from the crowd. It was Hammer, the man with the neck tattoos. If you had asked for it, we wouldn't be here. You gave it away, expecting nothing. That's the only reason we're standing on this pavement. Jax walked Elias over to the back of the truck. He lowered the tailgate with a smooth click. Inside the bed, bolted down and secured with heavy-duty locks, was a professional-grade, stainless steel toolbox. It was the kind of setup Elias had dreamed of owning back when he had his own shop. Jax flipped the latches on the top drawer. Inside, row after row of chrome vanadium wrenches and deep well sockets gleamed in the morning sun. There were torque wrenches, diagnostic scanners, and brand-new air tools still in their protective oil. Elias reached out, his fingers hovering just inches above a half-inch drive ratchet. He didn't touch it. He seemed afraid it would vanish like a mirage. These are Snap-on. These are the best you can get. Only the best for a master, Jax said. We also took the liberty of stocking the side cabinets with oil filters, spark plugs, and a few gallons of high-grade synthetic. You're a mobile service now, Elias. You're not a homeless guy. You're the man people call when their iron breaks down. Elias finally touched the metal. It was cold, solid, and real. The smell of the tool oil hit him, a scent that carried him back to a time when he had a life, a purpose, and a home. He leaned his forehead against the side of the truck and let out a sob that had been building for 3 years. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was the sound of a man being pulled out of a deep, dark well. While Elias was having his moment, a black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon pulled into the gas station. It was the 2 developers from the day before, the ones who had been trying to pressure the city to clean up this area. They had a meeting scheduled at the site across the street, and they looked visibly annoyed that their path was blocked by 300 motorcycles. The driver, a man named Marcus in a $3,000 suit, stepped out. He didn't see the emotion of the moment. He only saw a nuisance. He walked toward the edge of the parking lot, waving his hand dismissively. "Excuse me, who is in charge here?" Marcus shouted, his voice high and shrill against the low murmur of the bikers. "You're blocking a public thoroughfare. We have a development meeting, and this gathering is highly inappropriate." The bikers nearest to him turned slowly. They didn't move toward him, they just looked at him. It was a silent, heavy pressure that usually sent men like Marcus running for their cars. But Marcus had a sense of entitlement that acted as a shield against common sense. "I'm talking to you," Marcus snapped, pointing at Big Mike. "And is that the vagrant? What is he doing in that truck? He's been trespassing on this corner for months. I've called the precinct 5 times to have him removed." The air in the parking lot seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jax, who had been standing by Elias, straightened his back. He didn't rush over. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace that suggested a predator who knew the prey wasn't going anywhere. "You're the one calling the cops on the old man?" Jax asked, stopping just a few feet from Marcus. Marcus straightened his silk tie. "It's a matter of property value and public safety. This area is being revitalized. We can't have people like him lingering. It's bad for business." Big Mike walked over, his presence dwarfing the developer. "Bad for business? You know what's bad for business, Marcus? Being the guy who tries to kick a man when he's down in front of 300 people who don't like bullies. Is that a threat?" Marcus asked, though his voice wavered. "It's an observation," Mike replied. "You see, Elias here isn't lingering anymore. He's a business owner. He's the lead mechanic for a shop we support. And this corner? This is where he's going to be doing his first mobile consultations. So, technically, you're the one bothering a local businessman." Elias had stepped away from the truck, watching the confrontation. For years, men like Marcus had looked at him with disgust. They had called him trash and eyesore. He had learned to keep his head down, to take the insults, and to move on. But as he looked at Jax and Mike standing up for him, something changed in his posture. He didn't hide. He walked over to the edge of the truck. "Mr. Marcus," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I know you want to build your high-rise. And I know I didn't fit into your brochure. But I've lived on this corner longer than you've owned that car. I've seen the people here. They don't need a high-rise. They need someone who can fix their heaters in the winter in their cars so they can get to work." Marcus scoffed. "And you think you're that person? With a gift-wrapped truck and a bunch of bikers? You'll be back on that crate in a month." Jax leaned in, his face inches from the developers. "Here's how this is going to work. We're going to be checking in on Elias. Every day, different chapters, different brothers. If we hear that you've used your lawyers or your connections to harass him, we're going to have a very long, very loud conversation about public safety right outside your office window. Every morning at 6 a.m., do you understand?" Marcus looked at the 300 bikers. He looked at the cameras on their phones. He realized that he wasn't just dealing with a homeless man anymore. He was dealing with a community. He turned without another word, got back into his G-Wagon, and peeled out of the station. The bikers erupted in cheers. "All right, enough talk," Big Mike shouted. "Elias, you've got a job interview at 1 p.m., but before that, you need to look the part. Hammer, take him to the shop. Get him a haircut, a shave, and some real work clothes. The rest of us? We're going to escort the new business owner to his first day of work." The next few hours were a whirlwind for Elias. He was whisked away to a barber shop owned by a friend of the club. As the gray, matted beard was trimmed away and the wild hair was cut into a clean, professional style, Elias looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. He saw a man with sharp, intelligent eyes. He saw the mechanic he used to be. They took him to a workwear store where they bought him heavy-duty Carhartt pants, reinforced boots, and several dark navy work shirts. On the pocket of the shirts, the club's seamstress had already embroidered his name in gold thread, Elias. When he stepped out of the store, the bikers were waiting. They had used the time to decorate the Silverado with small Hells Angels decals on the rear window, a silent warning to anyone who might think of messing with the truck. "You ready, Elias?" Jax asked, leaning against his Harley. "I've never been more ready in my life," Elias said, climbing into the driver's seat. The procession began. It was a sight that people in Seattle still talk about to this day. A silver pickup truck led the way, followed by a 300-bike escort that stretched for blocks. They didn't speed. They moved with a slow, regal pace, a funeral for Elias's old life and a parade for his new one. They arrived at Miller's Garage, a vintage shop on the south side. The owner, Sarah Miller, was standing out front. She was the daughter of a legendary mechanic who had recently passed away, and she was struggling to keep the business going without a lead technician who understood the old iron. When she saw 300 bikers pull into her lot, she looked worried. But then she saw Jax, whom she had known for years. And then she saw Elias. Elias hopped out of the truck. He didn't look like the man on the crate. He looked like a man who had just come off a 20-year career at a high-end restoration shop. He walked up to Sarah and extended his hand. "My name is Elias," he said. "I hear you have some engines that need a doctor." Sarah looked at the truck, then at the massive escort behind it, then at the tools in the back. She smiled, a look of pure relief crossing her face. "I've got a '65 Mustang in the first bay that hasn't started in 3 years. If you can get that running, the job is yours." Elias didn't even go inside to sign paperwork. He grabbed a diagnostic light and a set of wrenches from his new toolbox and walked straight into the bay. The bikers stayed. They didn't interfere. They just leaned on their bikes, talking quietly, watching through the open bay door. For 45 minutes, the only sound was the clinking of metal and Elias's occasional grunt of concentration. He was in his element. The world outside, the rain, the hunger, the cold, it all vanished. There was only the smell of gasoline and the logic of the machine. Suddenly, there was a cough, a sputter, and then the V8 engine roared to life, sending a cloud of blue smoke out into the lot. Elias stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. The Hells Angels went wild. They revved their engines in a synchronized salute that could be heard for miles. Sarah Miller laughed, tears in her eyes. "I think you're hired, Elias." Jax walked into the bay and put a hand on Elias's shoulder. "We'll leave you to it, brother. But don't think you've seen the last of us. We've got about 50 bikes that need a tune-up, and we only trust one man to touch the gaskets." As the bikers began to pull out of the lot, leaving the shop in a cloud of dust and chrome, Elias stood in the doorway. He looked down at the keys in his hand. He looked at the truck that represented his freedom. And then he looked at the shop that represented his future. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $1 bill, a new one he'd received in his change at the workwear store. He walked over to the shop's tip jar on the counter and dropped it in. "First one's for the next guy," he whispered to himself. But as the sun began to set on his first day of work, Elias realized that his story wasn't just about a truck or a job. It was about the fact that sometimes, when you give the world your last bit of hope, the world decides to give it back, with 300 brothers to make sure you never lose it again. Elias had found his family, and the city of Seattle had found a legend. Before we move further, where we see how Elias deals with a sudden crisis at the shop and how the Hells Angels respond to a new threat against his business, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been helped by a total stranger when you were at your lowest? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one of them. The first month at Miller's garage felt like a fever dream for Elias. He woke up every morning in a small, clean apartment the club had helped him secure. No more damp concrete. No more looking over his shoulder for the police. He'd spend his mornings with a cup of black coffee, staring at the silver Silverado parked out front, still unable to believe it was real. But the work was real. The grease under his fingernails was real. And the respect he saw in Sarah Miller's eyes every time he brought a dead engine back to life was the most real thing of all. However, life has a way of testing a man just when he thinks he's found smooth pavement. It was a hot Thursday afternoon, the kind where the asphalt seems to shimmer. Elias was deep into the guts of a vintage shovelhead motorcycle, a personal project Jax had dropped off, when a dark shadow fell across the garage floor. He expected to see a customer or perhaps one of the brothers stopping by for a chat. Instead, he saw 3 men in tactical vests, carrying clipboards and wearing the insignia of the city building inspection department. Leading them was a man Elias recognized instantly, Marcus, the developer from the gas station. He wasn't wearing his silk suit today. He was wearing a hard hat and a look of cold, calculated triumph. "Elias," Marcus said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I told you that you wouldn't last. I just didn't think it would be the building itself that failed you." Sarah Miller stepped out from the office, wiping her hands on a rag. "What is this? We've been up to code for 20 years. My father made sure of that." "Your father is gone, Ms. Miller," Marcus said, tapping his clipboard. "And the new municipal codes for this revitalization zone are much stricter. We've found 17 major violations in the last 10 minutes. Faulty wiring, improper hazardous waste storage, and a lack of modern fire suppression. This facility is a public hazard. I'm afraid I have to issue a cease and desist order effective immediately." Elias stood up, his heart sinking. He saw the game Marcus was playing. This wasn't about safety. This was about the land. Marcus couldn't move Elias from the corner, so he was moving the corner from Elias. By shutting down Miller's garage, he would bankrupt Sarah, force a sale, and finally clear the way for his high-rise. "You can't do this," Elias said, his voice raspy but firm. "We can fix whatever's wrong. Give us time." "Time is money, Elias. Something you and this shop don't have," Marcus sneered. He pulled out a bright orange sticker, "Condemned," and slapped it right onto the glass of the main bay door. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. After that, the city will begin demolition." Sarah slumped against a workbench, her face pale. This shop was her heritage, the last piece of her father she had left. Elias felt a familiar, cold weight in his chest, the feeling of being powerless. But then, he felt the keys to the Silverado in his pocket. He wasn't the man on the crate anymore. "Sarah," Elias whispered as Marcus and the inspectors walked away. "Don't lock the doors yet." Elias didn't call Jax. He didn't have to. The Hells Angels have a way of knowing when the wind changes. By 6 p.m. that evening, the low rumble of engines began to vibrate the tools on the benches. It wasn't 300 bikes this time. It was a core group: Jax, Big Mike, Hammer, and a dozen others who specialized in construction, electrical work, and problem solving. Big Mike walked up to the orange sticker, peeled it off with one thick fingernail, and crumpled it into a ball. "I hear we're having a work party." "Mike, they said 48 hours, Elias said, looking at the long list of violations Marcus had left behind. "It's a month's worth of work. The wiring alone. It's all old-school conduit." Jack stepped forward, tossing a heavy tool belt onto the floor. "Then it's a good thing we brought the overtime chapter. Hammer here spent 15 years as a master electrician before he decided he liked bikes more than blueprints. Shorty over there owns a plumbing supply. And the rest of these guys? They're just looking for an excuse to tear something down and build it back better." "We can't pay you for this," Sarah said, looking at the army of leather-clad men. "Who said anything about pay?" Jax grinned. "This is an investment in the neighborhood. Besides, we like the coffee here." What followed was a feat of coordination that defied every city ordinance in the book. Under the cover of darkness, the garage became a hive of intense, frantic activity. While the rest of the city slept, the Hells Angels went to work. Hammer was up in the rafters, his headlamp cutting through the dust as he ripped out miles of frayed, ancient wiring. He replaced it with modern, fire-rated Romex, working with a speed that only comes from years of professional experience. Below him, two brothers were installing a state-of-the-art fire suppression system they'd acquired from a warehouse renovation project. Elias was everywhere. He was the conductor of the orchestra. He knew every nook and cranny of the shop. He showed them where the old pipes were buried, where the foundation was settling, and how to bypass the ancient fuse box. He worked for 20 hours straight, fueled by nothing but black coffee and a burning desire to protect the woman who had given him a chance. But Marcus wasn't done. He had scouts in the area, and he knew exactly what was happening. On the second night, just as the new electrical panel was being hot-wired, two police cruisers pulled into the lot, sirens silent but lights flashing. A young officer stepped out, looking nervous as he saw 30 Hells Angels standing around a pile of construction debris. "We got a report of unauthorized work being done on a condemned building." Big Mike stepped forward, his arms crossed over his massive chest. "Just doing some cleaning, officer. Maintenance. Last I checked, a man's allowed to sweep his own floors." "The report says major structural and electrical changes," the officer said, glancing at the bright new conduit running up the wall. Suddenly, a car pulled up, a modest sedan. A woman stepped out. It was Jennifer, a local attorney who specialized in tenant rights. She had been the one who handled the club's legal paperwork for years. "Officer," Jennifer said, holding up a briefcase, "I have here a temporary restraining order against the building inspection department. It seems there was a massive oversight in their filing. They failed to provide the mandatory 30-day right to remedy period before issuing a cease. This building is legally open for repairs until a formal hearing is held in 3 weeks." The officer looked at the paperwork, then at the wall of bikers, then back at his partner. He wasn't looking for a fight, and the paperwork was ironclad. "Fine, but keep the noise down. Neighbors are complaining." As the cruisers pulled away, the bikers let out a cheer. But Elias knew the battle wasn't won. Marcus wouldn't stop at building codes. By the morning of the 48th hour, the shop was transformed. It wasn't just up to code. It was the most modern garage in the district. The walls had been painted a clean, industrial gray. The lighting was bright LED. The hazardous waste was stored in double-walled, EPA-approved containers. Marcus arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, flanked by the city inspectors and a local news crew he'd invited to film the eviction of a public nuisance. He wanted to be the hero of the story, the developer cleaning up the streets. "Cameras ready?" Marcus asked the reporter, smoothing his hair. He walked up to the bay door, ready to call the sheriff's department for the forced removal. The door rolled up automatically, smooth, silent, and fast. Elias stood in the center of the shop, wearing his navy work shirt, his silver beard trimmed, his eyes sharp. Sarah Miller stood beside him, holding a stack of certified inspection reports. "Welcome back, Marcus," Elias said. "You're just in time for the re-grand opening." Marcus looked around the shop, his jaw slowly dropping. He looked at the ceiling, new lights. He looked at the walls, new wiring. He looked at the fire extinguishers, all tagged and certified. He grabbed the clipboard from the lead inspector. "Check the wiring. Check the drainage. There's no way they did this in 2 days." The lead inspector, an older man who looked like he'd seen it all, walked through the shop for an hour. He tested the outlets, checked the water pressure, and examined the structural reinforcements. He walked back to Marcus and sighed. "It's perfect, Marcus. In fact, it's better than the city requirements. I've never seen a renovation this clean in my life." The news reporter, sensing a much better story than a simple eviction, shoved a microphone in Marcus's face. "Mr. Marcus, it seems this local business has gone above and beyond to improve the community. Do you have a comment on the Hells Angels renovations that saved this historic landmark?" Marcus turned purple. He stammered, looked at the cameras, and realized his revitalization plan had just become a PR nightmare. He turned and fled toward his car, the news crew following him, asking questions about his harassment of a veteran mechanic. As the G-Wagon sped away, Jax walked over to Elias and handed him a cold bottle of water. "He'll be back, you know. Men like that don't like losing. Let him come," Elias said, looking around at the brothers who were still picking up the last of the debris. "He thinks he's fighting a mechanic. He doesn't realize he's fighting a family." That evening, the shop didn't close at 5 o'clock. Instead, Sarah fired up a large grill in the back lot. The Hells Angels brought crates of food and drinks. It wasn't a biker party in the way the movies show it. It was a community gathering. Neighbors who had been afraid of the men in leather for years started drifting over, drawn by the smell of burgers and the sight of Elias laughing with Jax. One elderly woman, who lived in the apartments across the street, walked up to Elias. "I've lived here 30 years, she said. "I've watched this shop go downhill since Sarah's father got sick. Thank you for bringing it back. We need people who fix things, not just people who tear them down." Elias felt a lump in his throat. He realized then that the dollar he'd given Jax hadn't just bought him a truck or a job. It had bought him a place in the world. He was no longer a problem to be solved. He was a solution. But as the night wore on, Hammer pulled Jax and Elias aside. His face was uncharacteristically grim. "I was monitoring some of the city council feeds," Hammer said, showing them his phone. "Marcus isn't going after the building anymore. He's going after the land itself. He's petitioning for eminent domain to build a new municipal substation on this exact lot. If the city votes yes, they can force Sarah to sell at whatever price they set. And the vote is next Tuesday." Elias looked at the garage he'd just spent 48 hours saving. "Eminent domain? How do we fight that? That's the government." Jax tightened his grip on his beer. "You don't fight the government with wrenches, Elias. You fight them with people. And it just so happens we know a few thousand people who don't like being told where they can and can't stand. The Hells Angels weren't just going to fix a garage. They were going to take on City Hall. What would you do if the home you built was being taken away by a powerful developer? Would you pack your bags, or would you stand your ground? Let me know in the comments. Your support is what keeps these stories of brotherhood alive." The news of the eminent domain petition hit the garage like a sledgehammer. Elias had just begun to feel the floor beneath his feet again, but Marcus was a man who played with the ruthlessness of a shark. In the eyes of the city council, a luxury high-rise or a municipal substation brought in tax dollars and progress, while an old grease-stained garage brought in nothing but blue-collar workers and loud motorcycles. Marcus was betting on the fact that the city would value his money over Sarah Miller's history and Elias's redemption. "Eminent domain is a beast, Elias," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked over the legal notice that had arrived by courier. "They don't have to prove the building is unsafe anymore. They just have to prove that the land would serve a greater public good. How do we argue that fixing old Harleys and Fords is better for Seattle than a new city facility?" Elias sat at the workbench, his hands, usually so steady, twisting a shop rag. He looked around the garage. He saw the new conduit Hammer had installed, the polished floor, and the silver Silverado parked in the bay. He thought about that $1 bill framed at the Hells Angels clubhouse. "We don't argue with them, Sarah," Elias said, his eyes hardening. "We show them." Jax arrived an hour later. He didn't come with the usual roar of a large pack. He arrived alone, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He walked straight to the office and looked at the petition. "Tuesday morning," Jax muttered, tapping the date on the document. "That's 4 days from now. Marcus is moving fast because he wants to catch us off guard. He thinks we're just a bunch of guys who know how to turn a wrench and cause a ruckus. He doesn't think we can navigate the red tape." "Can we?" Elias asked. Jax looked at him and gave a slow, dangerous smile. "We've got brothers in every walk of life, Elias. We've got brothers who are lawyers, brothers who are architects, and brothers who have been sitting on city boards for 20 years. But more than that, we have the streets. And the streets are louder than any councilman's gavel." The strategy for the weekend was unlike anything the Seattle chapter had ever attempted. Usually, their presence was felt through intimidation or quiet charity. This time, they were going to engage in a full-scale heart of the city campaign. On Saturday morning, the Hells Angels launched Operation Legacy. It started with a massive community fair held right in the parking lot of Miller's garage. They didn't just invite bikers. They invited every family in a 10-block radius. They set up a free repair clinic where Elias and a dozen other mechanics from various chapters performed free oil changes and safety inspections for single mothers and elderly neighbors. Jax and Big Mike were on the grills, flipping burgers and talking to local residents about the history of the shop. They didn't talk about biker rights. They talked about neighborhood rights. They talked about how Sarah's father had fixed the neighborhood kids' bicycles for free for 30 years. They talked about Elias, the master mechanic who was being hounded by a developer just as he was getting his life back. By Saturday afternoon, the line for the Support Miller's Garage petition was 3 blocks long. People who had been afraid to walk past the clubhouse were now shaking hands with men in leather vests, realizing that these were the same men who had shoveled their snow and washed their streets when the police were too busy. But Marcus wasn't sitting idle. He saw the community support growing, and he decided to play his final, dirtiest card. Saturday night, while the neighborhood was quiet, a white van with no plates pulled up to the alleyway behind the garage. 3 men in hoodies stepped out, carrying heavy canisters of industrial paint and cans of gasoline. Their mission was simple: make the garage look like a gang-infested war zone. If they could spray enough hateful graffiti and start a small, accidental fire, the city council would have all the justification they needed to declare the property a blighted nuisance and seize it immediately. One man began to spray a jagged, red symbol on the back door. Another was unscrewing the cap on a gas can, preparing to douse the side of the building. They didn't hear the sound of the Silverado's door opening. Elias had been sleeping in the truck. He didn't want to leave the shop alone, and his instincts from years on the street had kept him alert. He stepped out of the truck, holding a heavy iron tire iron, not because he wanted to use it, but because he knew the language of the shadows. "That's enough," Elias said, his voice cutting through the night like a cold blade. The man with the gas can spun around, startled. "Get lost, old man. This doesn't concern you." "I think it does," Elias said, stepping into the light of the alley lamp. "That building belongs to a friend. And that paint belongs to a coward. The three men laughed. They saw a 64-year-old man in work pants. They didn't see the 300 brothers standing behind him in spirit. One of the men pulled a switchblade, the metal clicking in the silence. Last warning, Pops. Go back to your truck, or you're going to be leaking more than oil. Elias didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, handheld radio, a gift from Jax. He keyed the mic, Bay 1. We've got company. In an instant, the alleyway was flooded with light. The high-intensity LED floodlights Jax had installed during the renovation flickered on, blinding the vandals. From around the corners of the building, and from the roof itself, 6 Hell's Angels appeared. They didn't come running. They walked with a slow, terrifying confidence. Hammer was there, along with Diesel and a prospect named Spider. The man with the knife dropped it instantly. The gas can hit the pavement with a heavy thud. You guys lost? Hammer asked, his arms crossed, his tattoos glowing under the white lights. Because this is a private construction site, and we take trespassing very seriously. We were just, some guy paid us. The one with the spray paint stammered. We know who paid you, Jack said, stepping out from the back door of the shop. He hadn't been home either. And we're going to let you go. But first, you're going to finish that mural. Only you're going to use white paint. And you're going to scrub every inch of this alley until it shines. The vandals spent the rest of the night cleaning the alleyway under the silent watch of the Hells Angels. By dawn, the back of Miller's garage was cleaner than it had been in decades. Jax made sure to take high-resolution photos of the men, their van, and the gasoline, evidence that would never see a courtroom, but would serve as a powerful bargaining chip. Tuesday morning arrived with a sky of brilliant, clear blue. The Seattle City Council chambers were packed. Usually, these meetings were attended by a handful of retirees and bored journalists. Today, the room was a sea of navy blue work shirts and black leather vests. Marcus was there, sitting at the front table with his team of high-priced lawyers. He looked confident, though he kept glancing nervously at the back of the room where 100 Hells Angels stood in silent formation, their helmets tucked under their arms. The council president, a stern woman named Evelyn Reed, banged her gavel. The matter before us is the petition for eminent domain on the property located at 1402 South Jackson Street. Mr. Marcus, you have the floor. Marcus stood up, his voice smooth and practiced. He spoke about urban renewal. He showed digital renderings of a gleaming glass tower and a state-of-the-art municipal substation. He talked about cleaning up a troubled corner and removing elements that hinder the city's growth. He never mentioned Elias by name, but he spoke of transient influences that threaten the safety of the neighborhood. When he finished, Evelyn Reed looked at the back of the room. Is there any public testimony in opposition? Elias stood up. He felt the eyes of his brothers on his back. He felt the weight of the keys in his pocket. He walked to the podium, his boots clunking on the polished floor. My name is Elias, he began, his voice echoing in the chamber. A month ago, I was the transient influence Mr. Marcus is talking about. I lived on a plastic crate. I was invisible to most of you, but I wasn't invisible to a man who saw me as a human being. He turned slightly to look at the council members. You talk about the greater public good. I've spent the last 4 days at Miller's garage. In those 4 days, we've fixed 22 cars for people who can't afford a dealership. We've repaired 3 heaters for elderly residents. We've collected 5,000 signatures from people who live in that neighborhood. Not people who want to build a glass tower and leave, but people who live there. Elias pulled a stack of papers from his folder, the petition. These people don't want a substation. They want a community. They want to know that if they're down on their luck, someone will see them. Marcus wants to buy this land because he thinks it's empty. But it's not empty. It's full of us. Then, Elias did something no one expected. He pulled out the framed dollar bill Jax had given him back for the day. This dollar was given in kindness, Elias said. It started a chain reaction that rebuilt a business, saved a man's life, and brought a neighborhood together. Can your glass tower do that, Mr. Marcus? Can your renewal build a brotherhood? The room was silent. Even Marcus looked stunned. Then, Sarah Miller stood up. She walked to the podium and handed a folder to the council. This is a certified business plan, backed by a private investment group from the community. We are not only staying open, we are expanding to include a youth apprenticeship program. We're going to teach the next generation of mechanics how to build things that last. We don't need the city to seize this land. We need the city to get out of the way. The council members whispered among themselves. Evelyn Reed looked at the petition, then at Marcus, then at the 100 bikers standing in the back. She had seen a lot of developers, but she had never seen a neighborhood show up like this. Mr. Marcus, Evelyn said, her voice cool. Your petition for eminent domain requires a finding of blight. However, our inspectors visited the site yesterday and found it to be one of the most well-maintained facilities in the district. Furthermore, the public testimony today suggests that the greater good is already being served by the current occupants. She raised her gavel. The petition for eminent domain is denied. This council recommends that the city explore other locations for the substation, preferably ones that don't involve displacing active community hubs. Crack. The sound of the gavel was like a starter's pistol. The Hells Angels didn't cheer, they just nodded. They moved with a disciplined, quiet power, filing out of the room. Marcus sat at his table, his face white, his career as a neighborhood revitalizer in tatters. He had tried to take a man's last dollar, and he had ended up losing the whole block. Outside on the steps of City Hall, Jax walked up to Elias. He didn't say a word. He just pulled a leather vest from his bike saddlebag. It didn't have the full Hells Angels patch. That was something earned through years of trial. But it had a small, rectangular patch over the heart that read, "Friend of the Club." You held the line, Elias, Jax said, handing him the vest. My father always said, you don't judge a man by how he stands when things are easy. You judge him by how he stands when the world is trying to push him off his crate. Elias pulled the vest on. It fit perfectly. He looked out at the line of 300 motorcycles waiting to escort him back to the garage. He wasn't just a mechanic. He wasn't just a homeless man who got lucky. He was a protector. But as the bikes roared to life, a new message flashed on Jax's phone. It was from the South Chapter. There was a problem, a big one, and it involved a group that even the Hells Angels were wary of. Elias, Jax said, his expression darkening. The party's over. We've got a situation at the docks. And because you're the best mechanic we've got, we're going to need you to look at something that isn't supposed to exist. The story was shifting from a fight for a garage to a mystery that would test the very limits of the Hells Angels code. What was waiting for them at the docks? And why did it require a man with Elias's specific set of skills? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, make sure you're subscribed. The victory at City Hall should have been the end of the road, a chance for Elias to finally settle into the rhythm of the shop and watch the sunset from the front seat of his Silverado. But in the world of the Hells Angels, peace is often just the eye of the storm. As the 300 bikers roared away from the courthouse, the atmosphere didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a mobilization. Jax led the pack toward the Seattle waterfront, where the massive shipping cranes loomed over the sound like prehistoric monsters. They bypassed the main gates, weaving through a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers until they reached a secluded warehouse at Pier 42. This was no man's land, a place where the salt air was thick with the smell of diesel and secrets. What are we doing here, Jax? Elias asked, stepping out of his truck as the bikes hissed to a halt. I thought we were heading back to the garage to celebrate. Jax didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the heavy sliding doors of the warehouse. A brother from the South Chapter was hauling a vintage load, parts we've been waiting on for months. But he found something else inside the crate, something that doesn't belong in this country, and something that's currently ticking. The warehouse doors groaned open. Inside, Illuminated by a single, swinging industrial light, was a massive, wooden shipping crate that had been partially pried open. Standing around it were 10 men Elias hadn't met, hard-looking riders with the South Chapter rockers. They looked less like bikers and more like soldiers. "Elias, meet Silas," Jack said, gesturing to a man with a scarred face and silver hair. "He's the one who found the package." Silas nodded toward the crate. "I was looking for the shovel head frames we ordered from overseas. But when I cracked the lid, I found this." Elias walked over, his mechanic's intuition tingling. He peered into the crate. Nestled among the straw and heavy grease paper wasn't a motorcycle frame. It was a sophisticated piece of machinery, a block of polished titanium and glass fiber optics that looked like it belonged on a spacecraft. But what caught Elias's eye was the small, digital display embedded in the side. It was counting down. 3 hours 42 minutes and 15 seconds. 3 hours 42 minutes and 14 seconds. "It's a high-pressure maritime sensor," Elias whispered, his hands hovering over the device. "But it's been modified. Look at the wiring. Those aren't factory seals. Someone's turned this into a trigger." "A trigger for what?" Big Mike asked, his hand resting on his belt. "The docks," Elias replied, his voice barely an audible rasp. "If this thing reaches zero, it's designed to send a sonar pulse that can rupture the hulls of every ship in the harbor. It's not a bomb in the traditional sense, Mike. It's an economic weapon. It would sink the port's reputation and billions in cargo." "Marcus," Jack spat the name like venom. He knew he was going to lose the eminent domain case. He had a backup plan to devalue the entire waterfront, so he could buy it all for pennies on the dollar. The room went cold. The Hells Angels were used to bar fights and turf wars, but this was high-level sabotage. They were being framed for an act of domestic terrorism. "Can you stop it, Elias?" Silas asked. "We can't call the authorities. If the police show up and find the Hells Angels standing over a maritime trigger, we're all going to Leavenworth before the sun sets." Elias looked at the timer. 2 hours 15 minutes and 40 seconds. "I need my tools," Elias said, turning toward the Silverado. "I need the fine-point drivers and the voltmeter. And I need someone to hold a light steady. If my hand slips, the pulse goes off early." For the next 2 hours, the warehouse was a tomb of silence. 300 bikers stood guard outside, forming a 3-block perimeter to ensure no one, not Marcus's goons, not the port security, disturbed the work. Inside, Elias was on his knees, his forehead slick with sweat. He was back in the zone. The world of politics and homelessness vanished. There was only the logic of the circuit. He saw the trap Marcus had laid, the anti-tamper, wires hidden behind the main bus. It was a masterpiece of malice. But Elias had spent 40 years fixing things that people said were unfixable. "Steady, Jax," Elias whispered as Jax held a high-powered flashlight over the core of the device. Elias used a pair of needle-nose pliers to peel back a layer of shielding. He saw the primary link. It was a fiber-optic thread, thinner than a human hair. "If I cut this, the timer stops," Elias said. "But if I cut the wrong one, the signal sends." He closed his eyes for a second. He thought about the gas station. He thought about the dollar bill. He thought about the Brotherhood that had given him a reason to live. He wasn't doing this for the city. He was doing it for his family. Snip. The digital display flickered. The red numbers vanished. The low hum of the device died into a silent, harmless thud. Elias slumped back against the crate, his lungs finally remembering how to breathe. "It's done. It's a paperweight now." The warehouse erupted in a cheer that was quickly muffled by Big Mike. "Keep it down. We're not out of the woods yet. We still have the delivery to make." The Hells Angels didn't destroy the device. They did something much better. They packed it back into its crate, loaded it into the Silverado, and led a midnight procession to Marcus's private estate in the hills overlooking the Sound. They didn't break down the doors. They didn't fire a shot. They simply left the crate on his manicured front lawn with a single note taped to the top. The note wasn't a threat. It was a copy of the receipt for the gas station fuel, signed by Jax, with a simple message: "The debt is paid. Don't let us see you on our street again." By morning, Marcus was gone. His lawyers called the city and withdrew every pending application. His G-Wagon was seen speeding toward the airport, and his assets were frozen in a sudden, anonymous federal tip about maritime sabotage. A week later, life at Miller's Garage returned to a new kind of normal. The "Support Miller's Garage" sign was replaced with a permanent neon light that read, "Elias and Miller, Precision Engines." Sarah and Elias sat on the tail of the Silverado as the sun set over Seattle. The garage was full of work, 3 vintage restorations, and a line of bikes out the door. "You did it, Elias," Sarah said, handing him a cold soda. "You saved the shop. You saved the neighborhood." Elias looked at his hands. They were covered in grease, just the way he liked them. He looked at the leather vest he wore over his work shirt, the friend of the club patch catching the orange light of the sun. "I didn't do it alone, Sarah," Elias said. "I just gave $1 to the right man." Down the street, the low rumble of a single Harley-Davidson began to grow. Jax pulled into the lot, his bike gleaming, his back straight. He didn't say anything. He just hopped off, walked over to Elias, and handed him a small, heavy box. "What's this?" Elias asked. "Open it," Jax said. Inside was a set of custom-made brass knuckles, but they weren't for fighting. They were welded into the handle of a master-grade torque wrench. On the side, it was engraved, "Property of the Brotherhood." "The boys wanted you to have a key to the city," Jax grinned. "But since you're a mechanic, we figured you'd want something you can actually use." Elias laughed, the sound deep and healthy. He stood up, walked into the bay, and picked up a wrench. He had a '57 Chevy waiting for him, and a life that was finally firing on all cylinders. As the screen fades to black, we see a final shot of the gas station where it all began. There's a new man sitting on a crate. He looks cold, he looks hungry, and he looks invisible. But then, a silver Silverado pulls up. The driver, a man with a silver beard and a leather vest, rolls down the window and hands the man a hot meal and a business card. "Come by the shop tomorrow," Elias says. "We're looking for someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty." Because at the end of the day, a Hell's Angel knows that the greatest strength isn't in the roar of the engine. It's in the hand that reaches out to pull a brother up. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. This story is a reminder that you never know the weight of the person you're helping, and you never know how far a single dollar can travel. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of brotherhood and second chances, hit that subscribe button and join our family. And remember, look out for each other out there. The road is long, but no one has to ride it alone. See you in the next story.